Oh yay, oh yay! Good folk of Britain, welcome to part the second of our story. It is Britain in 1988. Soulboy DJs Nicky Holloway, Paul Oakenfold, Johnny Walker and Danny Rampo have returned from their life-changing holiday where their minds were blown by the DJing of Alfredo.
Thank you, Mr. Town Crier. Hello, I'm Zoe Ball. Last week, we told the first part of our story, how UK dance music evolved from a pure soul scene through to the warehouse parties happening all across the UK. We left you on the B of the bang. Soulboy DJs Nicky Holloway, Paul Oakenfold, Johnny Walker and Danny Rampling had been introduced to the joys of ecstasy by Trevor Fung and Ian Paul, who owned a bar in Ibiza at the time. Those four intrepid musical psychonauts returned to Blighty in late '87 with a missionary zeal. They'd experienced firsthand the intense synergy between the chemical compound methylene dioxymethamphetamine, known as Adam or ecstasy, and electronic dance music. Legal in the US until 1984 and used musically by bands like Soft Cell as early as 1982, ecstasy had a profound effect on Nicky, Paul, Danny and Johnny. Radio 1's Giles Peterson was part of the London soul scene pre-1988.
I missed the trip when they all went out there, thank God. And they all came back and it was changed. Everything had changed. Their whole attitude had changed. It was peace and love and they meant it and it was radical. So Acid House has just kicked off and the first few records have come in from Chicago and from Detroit, Chicago particularly on tracks. And I go to this thing, I was DJing and I went to play in one of the rooms and I walked into the back room and in the back room all there was a strobe and they were playing acid tracks by Future. And my friend Michael Knott, the coolest jazz dancer, was dancing jazz moves to acid tracks by Future with a strobe behind him, and that to me was unbelievable. I couldn't. That was a very key moment for me because that song and the fact that a jazz dancer was dancing to that song meant that, you know, it just made it all relevant to me.
Simon Reynolds is the author of Energy Flash, a journey through dance music and rave culture.
Ecstasy is the perfect drug for a subculture organised around repetitive dance music and staying up all night and music that's very textured, because it's got this ideal combination of amphetamine-like element where it gives people energy to dance, it keeps them awake, it suppresses your appetite. All the sort of things that would disrupt you from dancing for hours on end are cancelled out by the speed sort of aspect of ecstasy. But it also has this side to it which is mildly hallucinogenic. It intensifies textures and all the senses become more vivid. So all music sounds better on ecstasy, but there's something about the shiny, glossy, futuristic textures of electronic music that just seem to really go with the ecstasy experience. There's a sort of aspect to ecstasy that opens up your emotions and it makes the world seem spangly and newborn. And that really fits with the whole future paradise vibe of electronic music like techno and house.
Nicky Holloway.
People who've taken it, got it. People who haven't, didn't get it. And I can remember people coming up to me saying, oh, I get it now, I get it now. And it sounds ridiculous now, it sounds really like silly now, but that's what happened. I mean, you can't deny it one way or the other. It happened.
Trevor Nelson was also a DJ in London at the time.
It was more of a white thing, the pill thing. We didn't really approve at all. Anything that left you out of control made me very nervous. To be honest, I think our music didn't really want us to take that. You know, our music was more laid back, it was more funky, it was more soulful, melodious. It wasn't four to the floor quite yet. And even when we did start playing that four to the floor stuff, we were just more buzzing off the music. Whereas I could see an army of people coming who all of a sudden liked house music. And I wondered where they got this love of this music from all of a sudden. And really it was so drug related because I lost a few mates to that scene. And all of a sudden at the same time, they're into certain drugs that they never took before. So the marriage between drugs and dance music is unbelievably tight.
The writing was on the wall for the traditional warehouse party by February of 1988. The high point for Trevor was an event which signalled the end of the warehouse party and the birth of something else.
It wasn't a rare groove warehouse party, it was at that turning point where house took over. And the same crew of people, I remember Roy the Roach was there, Jazzy Sound System was. I wasn't DJing that night, I just came as a punter. And it was all house music. And it's the first time I'd heard house music being played all night. Everybody came wearing the worst clothes they could find in their wardrobe because we knew it was going to be a big sweat down, you know. And it was incredible. It was just non-stop dance music. Everything that was experimental at the time, it was all new. Everything sounded new. You only recognised one in every 4 records, kind of. And that was because I sold them on the vans. And I knew at that moment that things are going to change.
The first club to embody this new feeling was held in a gym near Southwark Bridge in South London. The club was called Shum, which adopted the now familiar smiley logo in January of 1988. It was run by former soul DJ Danny Rampling and his formidable wife Jenny. DJ Terry Farley was onto it early.
You kind of didn't want too many of your mates in there because you had all these new mates. And you literally, you know, you picked your mates who you kind of thought were, you know, it sounds really terrible now, but who you thought were good enough. And then you had all your new mates. And all your other mates you just sacked, you know what I mean? They were gone, you know? You couldn't stop talking about it. And people would say, don't talk about it, you know? And it was really, really bizarre. Looking back, kind of like a cult.
The elitism was more about having the right attitude rather than the right clothes. Suddenly, London's clubland was turned on its head, and the likes of Boy George were being turned away. The bridge and tunnel crowds were now in charge.
The streets are full and they're ready to chow. Put the flames in the fire and the boiling smoke.
Cheryl Garrett was the editor of The Face at the time.
I think it brought in a different kind of elitism, if I'm honest, that the suburban kids were running it and saying to the people from the West End, like Boy George, no, you can't come into my club, which Jenny Rampling famously did at Shum, turned him away for about a month before she finally let him in. So for once, these kids who'd been queuing and begging, you know, that their clothes were sort of good enough to be let in, they were the ones in charge.
Early Shum regulars were DJ and producer Andy Weatherall and Terry Farley.
Pretty soon you had, you know, Bananarama, Pete Wiley, you had the lead singer Martin Fry from ABC, Michael Clark the ballet dancer, Keith Allen. They were all kind of Shum regulars. He was a real Shum face. But it still was elitist, that was the whole point. It remained elite, it's just a different elite. It's a bit like a kind of a communist coup, you know, where the Gang of Four are replaced by someone else, you know.
This song is from my heart. It wasn't easy from the start. Hey, can you see?
Terry Farley phoned me up and said, we found this great club, it's called the Shum. It's full of football hooligans on ecstasy. And there would be chaps that really shouldn't have been in the same building, let alone sitting next to each other having a drink. There'd be top-end Millwall hooligans, Chelsea, West Ham.
Music, take control.
Simon Reynolds.
Music that's good for your soul.
There was this kind of halcyon period where, under the influence of ecstasy, a lot of the sort of territorial rivalry between different football firms and groups of hardcore football supporters just melted away, and they found in music a sort of common ground for one. The other aspect of ecstasy is that it kind of breaks down people's sort of psychic defences. They become a lot more open-hearted, and it's kind of a sharing drug experience. It makes you want to kind of connect with people and empathise with them.
There's a lot of posh girls. And I was talking to this girl, and I remember she went to me, "Oh, what does your father do?" And my dad was a painter and decorator for the GLC. And I said, "Oh, my dad's a painter." And she goes, "Really?" She went, "Well, look, my mum's got a gallery in Mayfair. Maybe we should get him along." And it was like probably the first time that I'd ever mixed with someone like that.
Move your body across the floor. Punch your body like you want some more.
Collective crowd situation, it creates a different kind of energy where everyone just feels like they're on the same kind of track, you know, like they're all in the same, sharing the same kind of mood and vibe. When the track hits a certain peak, everyone's feeling that feeling. And you know, with Under Ecstasy, that is like sort of magnified 100-fold. So there's this sort of electric feeling of connection, like almost like the dance floor has become a single organism.
Up in Scotland, and indeed all over the UK, the same revolution was taking place. Harry Harrigan has been DJing in Glasgow for over 25 years.
It seemed to be a gradual transition from, you know, more and more good house records coming out to it starting to dominate. I remember everybody cheering at certain records and going crazy and thinking, wow, this is amazing, what is going on here? And then somebody said to me, they've all been taking ecstasy. And I was like, oh, right. But I thought it interesting that, you know, when you read articles now about Nicky Holloway and whatever going to Ibiza, you know, and Paul Oakenfold and bringing back the records that Alfredo was playing at the time, like William Pitt, City Lights and things like that. They were all records that were actually getting played in Glasgow, you know, at the Sub Club at that time. It was that eclectic, and maybe, you know, for them, maybe they were more of just a pure soul, rare groove vibe, so to them that was quite different.
This is a heavy road. Our love's a script.
House music, notably from Chicago on the Trax label, had been around for a few years and was being played at the Garage in Nottingham from around 1986. The resident there was Graham Park.
This new house music I was playing brought in a totally new crowd that were a bit kind of like soul boyish. All those kind of people who are into soul, funk and disco who kind of got this kind of house music. So they came down, and before we knew it, every weekend, Saturday night, it was queued around the Lace Market to try to get in the Garage. I remember actually it got so busy they demolished the bar to get a bit of extra room and put a DJ box up in the sky to get an extra kind of 50 people in. And within the space of like 2 or 3 months, these 1 or 2 imports a week had grown to half a dozen a week, to by the end of 86 like a dozen a week, and it really grew, and people were coming from all around the East Midlands to see me play.
The north-south divide we touched on in Programme 1 was still evident in the late 80s. One night, Graham received a visit from a promotions man from London, who is now a superstar DJ. Completely coincidentally, Paul Oakenfold was a promotions man in London at the time, and is now a superstar DJ.
And he actually came up to the Garage in Nottingham one night, didn't tell me he was coming, and everyone was like, who's that weird bloke over there? He's just standing there. Well, I don't know, he's a bit weird looking. At the end of the night, he came over and introduced himself. I'm from such and such a promotion company. I said, well, why didn't you tell me you were coming up? Well, I didn't actually believe that when I saw your charts, I didn't believe that you'd be playing this music on a Saturday night in Nottingham, which really pissed me off, because people in London really believe that they were the centre of the universe, and the rest of the country was, which they called the provinces, outside the M25. You know, we were in the kind of dark ages when it came to clubs and music. And he said, but yeah, you actually play all this stuff, which kind of like really annoyed me.
Dripping and dropping and dropping and dripping and 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 dripping and dropping.
The Hacienda's Hot Nights had also been playing house music for a while. Mike Pickering was the resident there.
It was almost like an extension of Northern Soul for us, house. It had the same 4 to the floor, same kind of tempo. But I remember playing January 1988, coming down as a guest at Fever Club, which was at the Astoria in Charing Cross. And it was mid-January, and I was playing like Strings Alive by Derek May and all the kind of new house stuff. And I looked up and everyone had their arms folded and was literally booing me. People used to pass notes for requests in those days, and I'm getting quite a few notes saying, "Why are you playing this Chicago homo music when you could be playing the real Rare Groove?"
Nicky Holloway.
He came down 6 months later, played the same records, and then went nuts.
I just thought, no, this is a truly international phenomenon, or it's going to be that, because what you had was a blank canvas. You had a 4-to-the-floor beat, and you could do anything you want. So I knew it was going to be a complete international thing. I'm not trying to be clever, but right from the start, I just thought, wow, this is absolutely massive, you know? And it proved to be that way.
Manchester can lay claim to being the first city to really get into house music in a big way. In typically modest fashion, the late Tony Wilson, Factory Supremo, explains why Manchester has such a musical vibrancy about it.
We are Britain's great immigrant city, and no one notices it because we are so successful. If you're leaving southern China, you either go to the northwest Pacific coast of America around Seattle, or you come to Manchester. Why? Because family have moved here, everyone says it's great, and there's a community. With a great immigrant city, we are open and hospitable. And similarly, we are open and hospitable to musical influences. Manchester kids have the best record collection.
And of course, there was a key substance in dance music's birth at the Hacienda.
Stella quid a pint. The point was that Stella was the Scallies' drink. In 86, 87, the Scallies were getting bored with kicking each other. And so they were drawn by Stella quid a pint to Pickering's Friday Night, where they were exposed to this wonderful new Chicago-Detroit music. And pretty soon, a band called Happy Mondays exposed them to something else. Little tablets. That's another story.
Sean Ryder.
I can remember the first time we went there, it was alright for us lot to go in, dressed how we wanted and get away with skinning up or whatever. And there was no trouble in there, great DJs, good bands and all that lot, but the reason we went there first of all is just because it was like big, dark, and you could just smoke and they played all that music.
Graham Park.
Nude was just the most incredible night. From 88 to 92, there was me and Mike playing this new house music, and it was really exciting, and we knew something incredible was happening in front of our eyes.
Let me take you to a place I know you wanna go. It's a good life. Hey, yeah. I don't wanna stand around and beg you, just don't say no.
Although I'd had a smaller scale night in Nottingham and Leicester and Sheffield, the night at Manchester, the nude night at Hacienda Manchester, had a whole different atmosphere and a whole different vibe. You could feel the electricity outside the club. Where Whitworth Street West and City Inn Road form crossroads, and there's a little pub across, people would be jumping out of cabs and running to join the queue, and you'd be getting out of your cab to go in, and just the electricity in the street was just unreal. I remember last year this guy was just taking some photographs of people involved in Manchester club life or nightlife, and he said, I want to photograph you at the crossroads outside Hacienda, even though the Hacienda's gone now. And so we did it on a kind of bit of a blustery, grey Manchester day, and for a minute there you could just feel, I know it sounds a bit corny, but you could just feel and hear those people. If you close your eyes, you could just feel that electricity and hear those car doors slamming and the tyres screeching and people going off to try and park the car and go and join their mates in the queue and people running across the road. It was just the most amazing feeling.
One of the youngest Hacienda punters was a kid called Alexander Coe from Harden on the Welsh borders. He later changed his name to Sasha and would become one of the world's premier DJs and a pioneer of a more progressive form of house music. An early influence on Sasha was a DJ called John Da Silva.
I remember the first night that he played Big Fun by Inner City. He kept on playing the opening riff to the track and then
dropping these thunderclaps in, and just the place just went mental. And he must have stopped and started it it felt like about 10 times. He probably only did it once or twice, but it just, when the record finally dropped, the place exploded. He did stuff like that. He used acapellas, and just by complete fluke chance, I moved into a flat, and he happened to live in the same block as me. So, obviously straight away we were talking about music, and so he started letting me do warm-up slots for him, and eventually I got a call to play at the Hacienda before him because somebody had let him down. I went on and played all his big records. It was the worst warm-up DJ ever. It was like 10 o'clock at night and the place was going mental because I was playing all his anthems. He must have just been sitting there thinking, what have I done? What have I done? I've unleashed a beast.
At this point, we should pay homage to a surprising but key character in our story, who resides a few miles down the road from the Hacienda in Leeds. He was spinning records on twin turntables and charging money for entry to people who wanted to dance just after the war. Sir James Saville talks us through that first disco.
I always thought that dancing to records was a good idea, and took a room which was an empty office near where I lived in Leeds, and the whole thing lasted for about 2 hours. But everybody voted it was a terrific idea, and it was a very good night, and that was the world's first disco ever anywhere in the world, that's for sure. No booze, no drugs, and no nonsense. I one day got the Westrex company to build me 2 speakers, independent speakers, big speakers. They were about 5 foot high each. They'd never done anything like that before. And I said, and I want 2 turntables, one beside the other. And they said, you don't need that, because these turntables run forever, they don't break down. I said, no. When they're dancing to the record on this side, I want to get the record ready on the other side. And they said, my God, I said, are they in that much of a hurry? Put a big sign out. Grand record dance, 1 shilling, you see. And underneath they put, bring your records, because they didn't have any, right? And the week before we'd done 26 people in this dance hall on this Tuesday night, and this record night we did 1,700. And it was immediate. There was a keys to the Bank of England, and it never ever looked back, and it's gone right round the world to what it is today.
Jimmy Savile is the original superstar DJ, no question. He is a legend. I mean, people bandy that word around willy-nilly these days, but Sir James Savile, OBE, is the original superstar DJ legend.
Now listen, Graham, I know that you've been avoiding me because you owe me a fortune of money, because you know that I invented your game, so really I should have at least half of what you make at that Hacienda gaff. Don't worry, I'll settle for a quarter. So either you send somebody around with a quarter, or I'll send somebody round to get it.
Well, Sir James, I would love to give you all of what I made from the Hacienda, but I'm afraid nobody made anything from the Hacienda. As I've said before many a time, it was a club run by hedonists for hedonists, and all we have are our memories, and you're welcome to them.
In February of 1988, the other side of the coin to the loved-up parties at Shum was a club called R.I.P. It was started by Lou Vukovic and Paul Stone, with Evil Eddie Richards, Mr. C and Kid Bachelor as residents. R.I.P. was held in a dark and moody venue on Clink Street in London, from where the slang for prison takes its name. The music here was a tougher, darker, edgier kind of deal altogether. Mr. C, later of The Shaman, was one of the residents. One night, fellow DJ Ashley Beadle got on the microphone.
We know you've been waiting, baby. Ashley's got on the mic and he said, okay, this is all about unity, it's all about coming together as one. Fingers what we're going to do now is we want to break through the wall at the end into the other room.
We gotta strip those springs and let you release all this heat inside.
And join the two rooms so that we're all partying as one.
Covered up by pride.
And with that, the room attacked the wall.
We're gonna bring down the walls, let them fall.
They ripped through the wall with their bare hands.
We're gonna bring down the walls.
These people were just like it was like madness, like cavemen, like really Neanderthal, the whole thing. They ripped through the wall, half the ceiling came down, plaster ceiling, everyone was covered in dust, there was dust everywhere, and it was hilarious.
It was in the June of 1988 that Nicky Holloway opened seminal acid house club The Trip at London's Astoria.
Called it acid house, but the very fact of the matter was, in Trip and and even Spectrum and all the German way, it was probably 10% acid house. The rest of it was just house music, and it was a bit slower and quite soulful. But we'd also be playing Rolling Stones, Salt of Soul, Carly Simon, Fashion Doves. It wasn't just house; it would go up and down. Quite a mixed, Blairic-y sort of eclectic mix, really. I mean, there was very little acid house. There was probably only like 10, 15, 20 records or two, but it just got labelled with acid house, It did feel like you belonged to some sort of movement.
Terry Farley's Boys' Own crew played the cooler stuff upstairs in the balcony bar.
The upstairs bit was where all the kind of what you would call sensible people would be, and me and Andrew would be playing like sort of what you would call Balearic, and then downstairs was just full on Todd Terry mayhem, Kids just going absolutely berserk. We were a bit snotty about it, everyone on the balcony bar, and all looked down our nose on it, but it's like I say, in retrospect, I do, and I know a lot of my mates do, wish we kind of, had a bit of it really, been a bit less kind of anal.
When we opened Trip, it was a lot of luck involved in a way. I mean, a lot of things are timing. Now, if you was to plan a big club night, you'd have a business plan worked out and a marketing plan, and it would all be done for you. You'd have a sponsor, it'd all be done like this. That time, we were just kids who were doing stuff that we liked doing, and if we made a bit of money, then that was great. But it wasn't the primary driving force, and it just felt like there was this new wave coming through. It did. It really felt like you. I mean, that's why we're talking about it 20 years later. I mean, you did feel like it was your Woodstock. It was your thing to tell your kids 20 years later.
Paul Oakenfold's night, Spectrum at Heaven, attracted Dr. Bob Jones, one of the most respected soul DJs in the UK. But by this time, in 1988, the soul scene was yesterday's news, yet Bob was still seduced by the sheer vibrancy of the club.
I've always been, very open, musically speaking. And I was hearing tracks, especially the vocal stuff, it was blowing me away. Things like C.C. Rogers' Someday, which is one of the early soul house tracks. I went there from the first one and right up to almost when it started to peter out. I just used to like going there from the energy point of view. The energy was unbelievable, and for the first time in my life, I saw people looking towards the DJ box, whereas I grew up as a supplement to the party. You were the catalyst for the party, a wedding or somebody's 21st, but no one faced you like an idol, like a almost godlike worship.
Trevor Nelson.
I'll never forget, I was working in a record shop And Paul Oakenfold, at the time, who was working as a plugger, as a promo man for Virgin Records, you know, going around promoting records and stuff. He'd been DJing as a kind of hip-hop and soul DJ. He started a night called Spectrum, and he was talking to me about it the first night. He said, we had a few hundred people.
Terry Farley.
It was just wildfire. I played it the first ever Spectrum, and there was 150 people in there. They give everyone a pill as who walked in. 150 people in a 3,000 nightclub, and it was fantastic. People just running around on the dance floor, waving flowers, and it was just brilliant. 2 weeks later, it was on its arse, and there was about 300 people in there. And then the next week, I walked down with my record box on a Thursday, and the queue went up onto Charing Cross Road, went down left, and there was 3,000 people there within 3 weeks.
And Paul Oakenfold became this superstar DJ overnight, literally. That's how quickly the music scene changed. The crowds for playing dance music became enormous overnight.
The message quickly began spreading across Britain, with venues like Castaways in Northampton hosting house nights. Fueling this enormous demand, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not, were the media. Ever since young people began to assert themselves culturally, various movements have been demonised. Mods, rockers, punks, even trad jazz fans at one time or another have been the catalyst for the breakdown of society and should be stopped. Cheryl Garrett was editor of Style magazine, The Face, at the time.
When the tabloids did their first story at the end of 1988, children taking drugs, dancing all night, wild orgies. I mean, would you want to go if you were 18? Again in 1989, when they started doing the illegal all-night parties, once the tabloids were onto them, hideously exaggerating everything, it sounded so great that if you lived in the suburbs of Birmingham, wouldn't you be on a coach straight down to the next one?
Nikki Holloway.
If you want to blame someone for taking it to the masses, blame the Sun newspaper, because the scene doubled as they started writing about how bad it was. People who wouldn't have even known about it found out about it. 1 week they're selling smiley T-shirts on Gary Bushell's page in the Sun. Next minute they're talking about evil acid house.
So young people enjoying music that the older generation didn't understand or like became the latest in a long line of folk devils. And these folk devils now had a name. Parties were evolving into raves and punters into ravers. Author Simon Reynolds.
Rave is one of those words that has sort of multiple sources. It's a Jamaican word. There's all kinds of reggae songs that talk about, going for rave at the weekend, and so it sort of means going to the dance or letting off steam at the weekend kind of thing. But also it had a psychedelic history. Pink Floyd played at a big all-night rave. It was one of the big psychedelic parties in 1967. And I think rave, the idea of the raver, of someone kind of dancing in a crazy way, even was a term that was used on the trad jazz scene in the late 50s and early 60s, when people were dancing to kind of Dixieland style jazz in this sort of quite frenzied way. Rave is a word that has sort of connotations of madness, of being out of control. It also has connotations of being a hysterical fan, they used to talk about teeny boppers as ravers. Basically, the word rave has this idea of incredible enthusiasm, but also sort of energy and passion that's kind of spiraling out of control, which is very appropriate for the evolution of rave culture.
By August, media hysteria peaked with the Sun's exposé of Spectrum, which was forced to close, or rather to reopen as Land of Oz, at Heaven owner Richard Branson's suggestion. Rave by this time had snowballed into a fully fledged phenomenon, attracting a new and to some slightly unsuitable punter. This new crowd were very different from the early Schummers. Terry Farley.
You could see what was so great. You could see it slipping through your hands. You could see it going, and you could see it not only going wrong, but people who you would have never let into Shum or Future were suddenly controlling it.
Wayne Anthony promoted the Genesis parties, some of the first huge raves.
We perfected the art of moving, up to 10,000 people from one place to another in a very short amount of time. It got to a point where we'd have one warehouse, but then we'd have a backup warehouse, and if that first warehouse got stopped, we'd then have to move 10,000 people to another part of London using just mobile phones, pirate radio stations, and meeting points.
These raves were enormous, and a great deal of effort was put into their preparation.
We'd do things like we'd put sawdust on the actual floor of the warehouse, and I'm talking about 100,000 square foot warehouses. I'm talking about gigantic warehouses. And so what would happen is when someone walked in, it would almost be like a cloud effect. I've seen people literally step onto the sawdust and think that they're falling through the floor or something, and like quite literally fall to their knees. On top of that, you'd have these laser lights, you'd have swings, we'd have fairground attractions, just put huge projections, we'd have fan lights, we'd have lasers, we'd have smoke machines.
There was a certain amount of dissent and disquiet from within the emerging dance scene. Trevor Nelson and Mr. C.
It was all about having a huge sound system and just boshing out acid house.
They got hijacked by people like Tony Colson-Hayter and the likes that were putting on these huge events for huge sums of money, like on the door, people charging people 20, 30 quid to get in, which was ridiculous 20 plus years ago or 18 years ago, whenever it was. And I think these are the people that really hijacked the scene.
And, drug dealers did great business and they made fortunes.
Simon Reynolds.
The original people, they complained about loads of kids coming, sporting it, like teenagers. One of the things they were concerned about actually was that they felt that, that their use of drugs was kind of mature and they knew what they were doing, but they were quite disturbed when they'd find 16-year-old kids on acid and kind of freaking out and not being able to deal with the drugs they were trying.
Terry Farley played at one of the first Sunrise raves.
We walked in and we walked through and there was a line of bouncers, and then 20 yards later there was a line of guys selling drugs. And literally, what do you want? And people just literally through there, queuing up. And some of the kids were like 14. Even at Shum, a lot of the people there were 15. A lot of the girls were 15, 16. And some of these were even younger. And it just made me feel very uneasy.
With this massive new market came the possibility of big untaxed profits. These opportunities were spotted by organised crime. And by December of 1988, promoters were being attacked with machetes and kidnapped by gangs. As we head into 1989, the stakes are raised, and so are the measures promoters had to take to avoid detection by both the constabulary and the criminal element.
Kids were actually buying tickets for places they didn't know existed. You could sell a ticket for £20 to a place that has no end. It just has directions on it. Phone this number, follow the sign, do this, do that.
That excitement became very much past the attraction. Locations were kept secret. Cheryl Garrett.
Suddenly, to be in a motorway service station and meet people from Birmingham, Leeds, Nottingham, Bristol, all looking for the same party, it was incredibly good fun.
Raves had become either the best thing in the world or the end of civilization as we know it, depending on your point of view. And a cat and mouse game on a grand scale would be played out up and down the motorways of the UK between police and ravers.
It wasn't like everyone was driving in their own cars, ringing into these phone lines. You were all gathered around 3 phone boxes in a motorway service station, 400 of you, waiting for the kid in the phone box to come out with news. They'd come out and everyone would be like, and then there'd be this, no, couldn't get through. And then suddenly someone would run, it's on, I know where it is. And it would be like the entire motorway services would be emptied within 30 seconds, everyone running to their car.
Enormous parties are thrown throughout the summer of '89. The Donnelly Brothers raves around Blackburn, featuring a young Sasha. White Waltham Airstrip in Berkshire, known as Ecstasy Airport. A rave promoted by Energy, which resulted in 20 miles of the M4 being sealed off. And Britain had its first ecstasy death. The government responded by setting up a special division to cope, the Pay Party Unit. In September, a pitched battle ensued between police and security hired by promoters Fantasy at a party in Reigate.
Police in the home counties made more than 50 arrests over the weekend in a crackdown on acid house parties. Hundreds of officers from different forces staged separate raids in London, Sussex, Kent and Essex. A number of people...
Over the airwaves, presenters on this pirate station, one of several, have started giving out cryptic messages about where to find the parties, or raves, and where not to find them.
And of course, if you actually found the thing, then it was amazing. You know, this kind of new world that had been built in a field just for your pleasure for the night. You're driving down a dark country lane with everybody going, we've done it wrong again, oh, this can't be right. Who are we following anyway? I don't know. And then suddenly you turn around, there's all these lights. The light is what you'd see first normally, because you normally have the car stereo cranked up anyway. And then you'd open your windows and they'd be like, coming from the fields. And then you just couldn't wait to park and run across fields through hedges or whatever obstacles were in your way, including by the end lines of police dogs and whatever. The police couldn't believe that with all these nice, respectable kids, you know, kids who look like their own kids, hurtling through police lines because they were so desperate to get into this thing and dance.
Heading into 1990, vast outdoor raves, illegal and legal, with 10,000 people or more, were becoming commonplace, and the Pay Party unit were becoming more successful in their efforts to close them down. So a strange alliance formed. The free festival scene in the UK had been mainly focused around the acid rock, beloved of festival travellers. Along the way, they'd acquired certain skill sets that would make them perfect partners for the urban ravers. At Glastonbury 1990, the Tonka sound system set up the first dance tents on a car park. Mark from Spiral Tribe.
It was otherworldly compared to the commercial arena, which I think most people refer to as Babylon. It had so much more going for it, so much more character, so much more, I don't know, reality. And as I remember it, there was a marquee there and there was the Tonka sound system in there. And it was the best party at the whole of Glastonbury, non-stop. And I think for me and the people I was with, that kind of opened our eyes to the possibilities of creating your own space and playing this kind of music that normally there wasn't really much contact with.
Travellers began hooking up with inner-city sound systems like Circus Warp, DIY and Spiral Tribe.
It turned into a way of life quite quickly. There was a real sense of urgency, and it just grew in a huge way beyond our expectations, and we obviously had to find not only larger venues, but it got to the point that we actually took it out into the country, outdoors, and connected up with the festivals, which at that point in time, because of the big political clampdown, were more or less empty. There wasn't anything going on. I mean, we were very naive. We were just kids from out of the city, not realising there'd been all these horrendous battles against the travellers and people organising free festivals in the years previously. And so we just went into freefall, took the rig out, and off we went. And suddenly everybody came out the woodwork and was very pleased that we were there providing the grooves.
Back in the clubs, in Stoke-on-Trent, Shelley's Laserdome began hosting Delight, featuring DJ Sasha, late of the Hacienda Manchester. Shelley's has passed into infamy, and with good reason. Sasha.
It was a really euphoric club, a euphoric crowd, and the music that came along at that time. The Hacienda had problems and it had closed down for a short period of time, and when it had reopened, I think the DJs and the owners of the Hacienda had made a conscious decision to move away from the kind of more rave, euphoric records, and actually, you know, Graham Park and Mike had really changed their sound and tried to push this American house sound, which some of us liked, some of us didn't, you know. And right away, at the time I was really into the big piano records, and they stopped playing anything that was even remotely close to that. And so that's when I started playing at Shelley's, and I was just dropping big piano breaks and stuff like that, and a lot of Italian techno records, big sounding records with riffs, and nowhere else was doing that at the time, and it attracted a really big buzz around it, and it was the first club that really got my name probably nationally recognised. You know, I was already doing all right in the northwest around Manchester, but a lot of A&R people that might have come up to hang out at the Hacienda were now stopping in Stoke instead of making it all the way to Manchester and coming and hanging out at Shelley's while I did silly things like scratch Whitney Houston a cappellas over the top of left field records and just daft gimmicks like that.
UK dance music now begins to develop a more distinct identity. Author Simon Reynolds.
And one of the things that happened was that Ecstasy created this kind of sort of crowd energy. That was amplified. The more and more people you had, the more and more powerful those sort of sensations of everyone feeling as one were. So there was a kind of logic to get bigger and bigger. So it started with the small clubs turned into warehouse events with a few thousand people out, and then the next step beyond that was to have it outdoors in these huge spaces with 10,000 people, 20,000 people.
A new sound was beginning to emerge, specifically tailored for these 10,000 plus mega raves.
What happened was that initially, you know, when people started making tracks in Britain, they were sort of very much like sort of copies of Chicago house and Detroit techno and kind of not very good ones. But then gradually a sort of distinctive UK sound began to emerge. And what happened in the UK was that a kind of fusion of influences occurred in Britain that didn't, for various reasons, couldn't actually happen in Chicago. So you started to get like a sort of heavy, a sort of real, it was actually other kinds of black music being added to house and techno. You had like a very strong reggae influence with these sort of boombastic bass lines, and also like a hip-hop influence.
Yorkshire played a pivotal role in the development of the sound of hardcore. It's a sound called bleep.
Some of the people who got involved in the early days of the house scene before that, immediately before that, had been really into hip-hop. And that kind of influence reasserted itself. And they sort of added these kind of looped breakbeats from hip-hop to the rhythm because it was funkier and it was actually kind of easier to do than actually program a drum machine. And so you ended up with this sort of bizarre hybrid sound. It was kind of like, had this hypnotic feel of house and techno, but also had this sort of boombastic bass lines from reggae and hip-hop, and this sort of gritty funkiness that came from breakbeats. And so it was sort of this mad mongrel sound that could only have occurred in the UK. One of the interesting things about Bleep is that it shows how sort of multicultural a lot of those cities in the north are. You know, in Leeds there was a whole kind of reggae culture based around Chapel Town, and some of the key sort of figures in the Bleep sound had actually come out of this sort of reggae sound system culture. These were sort of black British guys who turned on to techno, but they sort of kept some of the influence of reggae culture.
In Sheffield, Rob Gordon founded the Warp label, and with school friend Winston Hazel, made up 2/3 of important dance outfit Forge Masters, whose tune, A Track With No Name, would be heard in clubs like Sheffield's Jive Turkey.
Those records, however many were pressed, sold out pretty much straight away. Was it about a week or so? Within a week, we had no records left. It just went gosh. And so I said, well, I work in this business, you know, I work for EMI and different people commissioning me, and I've never seen anything this fast, you know, and it's actually really happening. So I think I better legitimise this straight away. I approached Winston's bosses at the shop, at the Fon Record shop, and I approached them about starting a record label because they'd seen it and, you know, we needed to do something real with it. And they agreed to that, and they said that they were expanding and they were buying a new shop next door, and they wanted to change the name because it wasn't exactly the same people as what was at the studio at that point. And so I suggested the name warp, we should call the label warp as well as the shop, so that it appears like a bigger enterprise. And we all agreed to that, and that's how the label was born.
The Warp sound was an amalgam of influences.
I've always been traditionally a reggae head, a dub fan. I've always been into electronics, so the use of electronics in a recording studio has always appealed to me. I was never into American music at all, unlike my friend Winston, and I've always had my friend Winston as my right-hand man when it comes to things to do with funk, soul, R&B, and I suppose I've added his influence to my reggae influence, and that may be what my sound is. It's essentially house techno music admitting the fact that we're black British, and that was just it was like a bit of an experiment, you know. Let me put some rockers on the house, see what goes on.
Techno, that was quite influential in Sheffield, especially with Sheffield having its experimental electronics music background, with bands like Cabaret Voltaire, Chak, etc. People really warmed to the techno sound here, I think, because it was so experimental and very blunt sounding.
The hardcore sound began to bleed through to the mainstream, with the poppier, sped-up breakbeats of 2 Unlimited, Utah Saints and SL2 all making the UK pop charts. But at Heaven, in London's Charing Cross, a darker sound was beginning to ferment. A night called Rage would become seminal for a very British type of music. The club was started by Radio 1's Groove Rider and Fabio.
That's where Jungle was born, basically. We was playing kind of like a lot of techno and early house in there, and early techno, and it kind of fused into kind of breakbeat. We used to play the odd breakbeat song and realised that the real ghetto kids loved it. Whenever they used to hear the kind of, instead of the 4 to the floor of house, the breaks take on a life of their own in a bizarre sort of way. That's why I like breaks so much. And the kids seem to have this affinity with breakbeat.
The seeds of what was to become known as Jungle had been planted.
We kind of changed the emphasis of the night. You know, it'd been a real purist house night when it first started, and we kind of like mutated it into this kind of like mad kind of breakbeat driven night.
In May of '92, a group of sound systems attempted a free party at the Avon Free Festival near Bristol, but was stopped by police. The convoy ended up at Castle Malton in the beautiful Malvern Hills. Mark from Spiral Tribe.
When we first arrived, I mean, we were probably the second or third sound system in the area. We'd been waved on to site by smiling policemen, so everything looked fine. They busied themselves playing rounders for the whole week and didn't seem at all concerned about anything. I think they rather enjoyed it actually.
The event was picked up by the BBC 6 o'clock news, and by Saturday night, police estimated that 50,000 people were there.
It was just unbelievable the amount of people that kept rolling onto site. So it just got bigger and bigger. And I think the Conservative estimates were that there was 50,000 plus people there by the end of it all. It was incredibly intense.
Simon Reynolds was in the crowd. He was a relative newcomer to the open-air rave.
I'd heard of the Spiral Tribe, and I'd been to like a small party they'd done in North London in an abandoned pub or something, and I'd never been to one of their country things, so I was really excited to go to one. And setting out, I thought it would be like one of their, 5,000 people in the quarry kind of events that they'd done before. I had no idea that it was going to be this massive thing, and it wasn't just Spiral Tribe, there were several other sound systems involved. Somehow word of their events had sort of spread, and all the sort of factors came together, and it was like this sort of record-breaking event where you arrived and it was like a small city. It just appeared overnight. It was sort of this unmappable chaos of caravans and tents and sound systems, and also it was like kind of like a marketplace as well. There were all these people selling everything, selling drugs, but also selling souvenirs and clothing, and it was like a sort of medieval marketplace or Middle Eastern bazaar. not a planned city, like very chaotic, no sanitation. So there was a sort of unsavoury, squalid aspect to it, where the perimeter of the rave was kind of dangerous to walk in because it was full of, urine and excrement. But the actual party itself was this utopian city that had sprung up, where no one was in charge, but everything was celebration and unity.
The Spiral sound system was pumping for the whole week. Whether that was a 5, 6 or 7 day week, I'm afraid I don't remember. We were one of the first people on site and we were the last to leave. We were always the last to switch off. You want it to be loud enough to feel. When you're dancing, you want to feel the bass in your stomach, you want to feel the mids in your chest, and you want to feel the tops on your eyelashes, don't you? It's all about moving air.
Castle Moulton was one of the defining moments of rave culture. Nothing would be the same again. Next week, we'll hear about dance music's shift towards mainstream acceptance, how the sound began to divide into separate specialist strains of dance music, and how one superclub regenerated an entire area of one of our great cities. The Definitive History of UK Dance Music was produced by Simon Poole and Vivian Perry, researched by Lucy Greenwell, and audio production by James Beard. This has been a unique production for BBC Radio 2.